Hello, everyone. You can't, now they put the lights on, I can't see you, but I know you. There's quite a number of people in the room, so it's really great to see you here. So, as I think I've just been introduced, I'm Marie Gabriel, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the NHS Race and Observatory session today. And we're going to be discussing the economic and financial costs of racism in health and care. And actually, really importantly, consideration of some of the things that we can do to tackle racism and actually ensure that we address the wasted millions. I'm really privileged to be joined by this incredible panel of speakers. When I was told I've got 5 minutes to introduce them, I was really shocked because their lives have actually been dedicated to tackling inequity and fighting for social justice. So, first of all, we have on my right, Shriha, who is a patient advocate and works in the medical industry with Johnson & Johnson, and she's committed her life to creating environments where people can progress and prosper. She was going to share a very, I think, quite emotional when I watched the video, personal family experience, and how that experience has led her to work with NHS England to be an advocate for people who are no longer with us, and to be their voice and to be determined not for them to be forgotten. We have Andrea Sutcliffe, who I'm sure is known to the majority of people in the room. CBE, she's the Chief Exec at the Nursing and Midwifery Council, but I have followed Andrea's career through NICE, the Appointments Commission, the Social Care Institute for Excellence, the CQC, and then into her current role. And always, always, Andrea has had equity and anti-racism at the forefront of her leadership. And now to two of my colleagues on the Race and Health Observatory Board. And again, I don't believe they need any introduction. And they are nationally and internationally known for their work on race and equity. First, we have Dr. Chand Nagpal, who's a GP and senior partner in his practice. But also, Chand has been really there advocating for doctors from when he first was elected to the BMA in 1996, and then to becoming the first Black and Asian minority ethnic chair in its 190-year history. He personally led the BMA Racism in Medicine report, which was published last year, and also continues to chair the BMA's Racial and Ethnic Forum for Equality. So really great to have you, Chand. And then the wonderful Yvonne Coghill CBE, who began her career as a nurse and has been involved in NHS for over 40 years. I haven't said exactly how long, Yvonne. She's held many, many strategic leadership roles. And what we do really know is an amazing amount of programmes that she's led that have really changed how the NHS addresses racism. It was a privilege to meet some of the senior leaders yesterday in the bar who have been part of her Black leadership programmes. And she led the creation of the Workplace Race Equality Standard and its delivery. She devised the pioneering race equality strategy for London, and where we have in London actually started to see a positive shift. Yvonne is international and is a member of the IHI board, as well as, and has developed its inclusion strategy, and she now has her own company, so if you need her, she's here.
Thanks, Marie.
So just a few slides, really, and just to sort of give an overview before I turn to each of the panel members who are going to give 5 minutes on the cost, but also some of the solutions. So we know that ethnic inequalities are evident, and actually before birth, all the way through to our death. At the Race and Health Observatory, our role is to gather evidence and new insights, change those into practical recommendations, and then support the NHS to implement them. There's not a lot of information on the financial cost in the UK or the economic cost of racism in health and care, but we do know from America that the costs are in billions of dollars. And we have been doing some work, not the Race and Health Observatory, but there is some work in terms of mental health and how the costs for black people is over £2,000 more, and this is caused because of lack of early intervention, the nature of the treatment that they receive once they do access the system. And the human cost is immeasurable, I believe. I don't think you can put an economic cost on that. And we know that's from people from black communities more likely to die in childbirth, right through to the experience of our staff, our workforce, and how they're more likely to be harassed and bullied. So I only had 5 minutes, so I can't go through, but the Race and Health Observatory has been developing an anti-racist approach for tackling health inequalities, and are working on a pilot with IHI and a group of integrated care systems. I think I've done more than my 5 minutes, so I'm now going to hand over to Shahiba to really talk about her experience in the NHS and the work that she's been doing to ensure we improve. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. I mean, firstly, it's a privilege to be on stage with so many advocates for, you know, all the things that we're striving to do. And I guess before I start, it'd be a remiss of me if I didn't mention the man himself. So my dad actually moved from Pakistan to the UK when he was a young child back in the early 60s. And right from the beginning, he wanted to be integrated. He wanted to be part of society. And as I, grew up and saw the things that he was doing, he was very much involved in a lot of the community events, really being an advocate for the NHS, for the men and women that work, to help restore people back to, pre-disease or accident lives. And he was a great inspiration to myself and my siblings, who have gone on to forge careers within the health industry. And I think, being here today just gives us a realization as to how strong we are as a family to be able to put what happened to him aside and actually put the system first, because that's what matters to us, to be able to provide the right healthcare for people moving forward. So I guess for me, it's really important that I get the key messages of his story across to you. During the pandemic, he was very cautious, looked after himself, protected others. Didn't integrate with anyone outside his household, but as with so many others, he still fell ill. He caught COVID at the end of January 2021. The kind of person that he was, he really didn't want to be a burden on the NHS, especially when there was so much going on. So he stayed at home as long as he could to be able to fight it and nurse himself for as long as he could. Until one Tuesday morning, he rang me. And during the last 2 weeks, his voice deteriorated. But one Tuesday morning, he rang me, and there was a strange calmness in his voice, a calmness that almost was full of confidence. And I was like, "Dad, what's going on?" And he's like, "I've called an ambulance. I can't look after myself anymore." And I guess it was that belief that he had in himself, to know that he's going to get the care that he needed at that point in the time. And I didn't second guess to stop to think that he wouldn't receive the care that he needed at the time. The ambulance came and took my dad, and I guess that's where his story starts for us today. When he went into the NHS system, it took us 4 days before we actually found out where Dad was, or indeed if he was alive. And one of the first comments that was made to us when we did eventually track down where he was the fact that the nurse quoted, "You lot have large families." So it's a surprise that we didn't have any next of kin details on his files. In any given situation, that would have, I would have totally refuted that. But given the fact that we were just elated to know that he was alive and he was, in a place where we knew he would get help, we totally overlooked the comment, and that was it. We went into pilot mode, I guess, just to know how Dad is on a daily basis and do what we could do from afar, as many people were in that situation. But I guess during those first few days, there was lots of breakdown in communication. There was lots of things that went wrong in his care, things like next of kin details repeatedly being lost, him being moved around into different levels of care and us not being notified as a family. There was a DNR put on his file, as again with many families, we've heard lots of stories, but again assumptions were made because he was from a South Asian background, because of the culture, of the food, of the cuisines. There were so many assumptions made that he couldn't walk without assistance. And my dad had done his allotment just a few months before, so he was really well enabled to do that and go out and shop for himself and all the rest of the things. So a DNR was put on his file because assumptions were made that he wasn't physiologically fit to be able to be intervened with if he came to a stage and needed ventilation because of his diet, because of the fact that he couldn't walk, his immobility, which were completely false. We were given wrong information with another Mohammed that was on the ward at the time. I mean, to have two Mohammeds on the ward and to get them mixed up, it's not, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but to give the wrong information to the family and say, he's actually doing better, when in fact, when we then ring again, we were told that actually that's the wrong Mohammed and your dad's deteriorated, was quite devastating, because for all we knew, because we weren't allowed to visit, they were relaying our messages on to him to give him some reassurance that we were still there. During his time on there, he left notes which we got in his belongings afterwards, and you could read quite clearly until, I guess, a few days before he passed away, which they then turned into childlike scribbles. But he kept writing on there that he wasn't given water, he wasn't, his lip care wasn't done, his lips were fused together when we did eventually be able to go see him. That he was being shouted at, all the things that are devastating to hear and read back afterwards, but to imagine his pain, to be on a ward where you can only see endless people, in the same situation as you, and the care workers around them in PPE, and just feeling really terrified and alone. So he lost his self-worth, his self-dignity, self-respect in those 2 weeks that he was in hospital. Needless to say, if he had survived and come home, his championing and his advocacy of the NHS would have been shattered. I guess the final blow which came, which is probably the most devastating of all, and something that I'm still coming to terms with, is the fact that his final goodbye was done with the incorrect family. We waited and we rang up and said, we're still waiting for this call. Only to be told that it was already done. And then at the time, Mohammed had said, or Dad had said, that he didn't recognise them, that the people that were on the iPad, but he was told that he was delirious. So he spent 30 minutes with the wrong family. So not even having an opportunity to actually know that we were there all along. That is probably the most hardest piece to contend with, knowing that we tried as a family so hard to make him feel as though we were doing everything that we could do to support him from afar, but then not seeing us in his last moments must have been terrifying for him. I guess after Dad passed is where his story really starts in terms of what we wanted to do as a family. I think, death is given, death is inevitable to us all, but what's not given is discrimination, especially in our death or in our care. And when Dad passed away, his story coming out in the community as he was a community elder, everyone started using it as the reasons as to why you shouldn't trust the NHS, why you shouldn't go and seek help for any kind of ailment. This is why people were saying, this is why you should be getting medicine and getting devices off the internet rather than going to your GP or going into the health service, because you had a better chance of survival. And for me, as a person who has worked with the NHS for very, very many years, I've seen the good that it does, and I've seen countless number of lives that I've been privileged to touch, along with the people that I work with, where we've given people back their independence, their lives, and I didn't want the NHS to be muddied by all the things that when it does go wrong, when it falls into the wrong hands for propaganda. And I guess I owed it to my dad to actually work with the NHS, which he had done for so many years, to make things right. You know, he would be absolutely devastated if he realised that his story was being used against everything that he stood for. So that's when I met a couple of people in NHS England, and a big thank you to Leslie Goodburn, who's in the audience, and also Sarah Clasper, who I don't believe is here, but they really helped me put my grief channel my grief in a way where I actually could make an impact and make a difference. And we started working on his digital story, and how it can help NHS and how it can help healthcare professionals actually get the basic quality of care right. And have the compassion in care that you need, because there's no disputing death, right? None of us are sitting here disputing death, but what we are disputing is the discrimination that's being faced by so many. 250,000 people died with COVID during the pandemic, and only this week, Baroness Hallett opened up the questioning into the inquiry. But I put it to you, neither do I, or do you ladies or gents need a report to tell you what the cost of discrimination is? Whether it's biases, whether it's microaggressions, whether it's not knowing the culture nuances, the role that faith or ethnicity plays in the patients coming into the system, these are all things that you can be doing today and taking that away with you today. We don't need to wait for a report to tell us where it's gone wrong and how we put it right. And some of the solutions will be talked about as we go on, but it's important for me that Dad's story was out there to actually help organisations be able to put the training that's needed, because it doesn't cost a lot. It just needs dedication, it needs resources, and there's plenty of resources out there, like my dad's story. And it just needs you to have that dedication to say, actually, patients coming into the system don't belong to the system. They still have relatives, they still have next of kin, they still have people out there who love them and want them back. And you've got to be able to communicate with them. You've got to be able to understand the backgrounds that they come from. And Dad always used to say that when he first arrived, he tried so hard to blend in, and it was only through the years where he realised that he actually needs to make space for himself and not blend in. He, for many years, went out of his way to please people, and that's what he thought was the right thing, because that's what integration felt like for him. But it was only, I guess, when his children came along and he didn't want us to feel that burden of wanting to please and to actually blend in, that he started to find his voice, and really detach from the fact that he's able to make a difference within his community. I guess one of the last things that I'll say, because I've also overran, is that the story is available on NHS England. Please do try and have a look at the digital story. It was done right at the beginning, so there's a lot of, I guess, raw content in there, and we've come on a while since then. But please use it within your organisations. Use myself, Leslie, all the people that are here to actually to make the difference, because we're all here and we're all willing and we're all able to help you make the difference. So thank you for sharing my dad's story with me.
So I just really want to thank you. I have seen the story several times and it hurts every time, and so there's no thanks needed from you. We're just really privileged for you to share that story, and actually privileged for you to get to know the amazing man that your father was, and we are determined to use that story and others like that to change how we work with our diverse communities and our workforce. Thank you, Shabib. Andrea.
Okay. Thank you, Marie. I want to speak about the cost of racism from the perspective of the impact on nursing and midwifery professionals. But before I do, I want to say to you, Shabir, thank you so much for sharing your family's utterly heartbreaking experience with us. Like Marie, I've watched the video. Yeah, you all should, basically. And it's important that we hear these stories, but we should never underestimate the impact, the personal impact of telling them. And our response has got to be to act, to make a difference. for you, Shabir, and for your dad and for the family. So the Nursing and Midwifery Council regulates nursing and midwifery professionals across the UK. There are over 788,000 people on our register. They are the biggest professional group that spends the most time with people using health and social care services. They are safety critical professions. And we set their standards of proficiency and conduct, maintain the register and investigate concerns, which means that we've got a clear role in helping to make sure people using services do so free from discrimination, bias and racism. The code, which you can get on our stand at 17A, it explicitly asks our professionals to prioritise people, to make sure that those receiving care are treated with respect, their rights are upheld, and any discriminatory attitudes and behaviours are challenged. But nursing and midwifery professionals experience racism themselves. Marie has already told us that Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff are more likely to experience bullying, harassment and discrimination than white staff, and they are less likely to be appointed or promoted. And we see this in our own work at the NMC. Black professionals are disproportionately referred into our fitness to practice procedures, and I know it's the same for doctors at the General Medical Council. The racism that affects clinical professionals comes at a cost, and that cost is safe care. Nursing and midwifery professionals are a diverse group. Over a quarter come from a Black or other minority ethnic community, or perhaps we should say more correctly, the global majority. 1/5 of our register comes from overseas. They all make an incredibly valuable contribution to our health and social care services, but they are not always valued as they should be. We're currently piloting a Welcome to the UK workforce session for newly arrived internationally educated nurses and midwives. What they tell us should shock us, but it doesn't, because it happens too often to be a surprise. Just a few quotes. When I asked for support, I was ignored. People were talking about me behind my back. I would go home after every shift and cry. They're miles away from home, vital to our work in health and social care, and that's the way that we treat them. It's wrong, and it impacts on safety. Racism has a corrosive effect on your health and well-being. It undermines your confidence. It makes you feel unsure of yourself. It makes it difficult to ask for help when you need it. If you've been the subject of so-called banter or aggressions from your peers, will you ask them for advice? Will you seek their support in a difficult situation? Will you feel confident to challenge when you see something going wrong? Health and social care is a team sport. If you can't rely on your colleagues, the people you care for may suffer the consequences. Marie has asked for solutions, as she always does. And I'm sure many of you were here yesterday for the session Saffron Caudry chaired on health inequalities. And I was really struck by the simplicity of Owen Williams's approach. What he said was, when you see discrimination, be sure. See, understand, respond, evaluate. We must all do all of those things. We have our codes, we have our guidance. I'm very proud of the work that we did last year with the NHS Confederation and NHS England to produce an anti-racist resort. It makes it absolutely explicit. To be anti-racist, you are living the NMC Code of Conduct. And if you're living the code, you've got to be genuinely anti-racist. But as Yvonne told me at the time, if the complex issue of race inequality could be erased by the production of codes and guidance, we would already live in a fair and equitable world. You were right as ever, Yvonne. Codes and guidance signal intent, which must be lived and acted upon to make a meaningful difference. Which takes me right back to the beginning and Shabir's story about her dad. We honour his memory and her family's suffering by being determined to act to make a difference for our colleagues and the communities that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
Excellent. Chand. Very good.
Brilliant. Chand.
Okay. No, I want to also thank Shabir. I've watched the video and I don't think it's the link's there, but please just search for it and watch it. It really, does give you an incredibly important insight. Thank you. I want to, in fact, build on what Andrea has said and speak on behalf of the medical profession. And it's, it's really important to state at the outset that the fundamental founding value that we all ascribe to in the NHS of treating people equally is being flouted on a daily basis for tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of healthcare workers. Now, for the medical profession, 42% of the NHS workforce come from ethnic minorities, 42%, and about a third have qualified from overseas. Now, race discrimination sadly starts from the beginning of the onset of your career in medicine. 4 times as many ethnic minority medical students report bullying and harassment. That continues when you qualify as a doctor, with twice as many ethnic minority doctors reporting bullying and harassment. If you look at regulation, similar to for nurses, you are twice as likely to be referred to the GMC if you're from an ethnic minority, and 3 times as likely if you have qualified from abroad. A recent study showed that if you anonymize cases of disciplinary referrals, you actually reduce that disparity. So this is living proof that, in fact, the chances of being referred within your own workplace is actually racially determined to a large part. If you look at career progression, everyone wants to progress in their career, and yet you find that if you are from an ethnic minority, you're far less likely to pass postgraduate examinations, and even worse if you're an IMG. Now, when you look at the data, you're far less likely to pass even if you are an ethnic minority trained and educated in the UK. It defies logic. And so when you've actually looked at the research around this, and Catherine Wolfe at UCL has done a lot of research, it's certainly not due to lack of ability. The reason why ethnic minority doctors don't pass postgraduate exams as the same rate is because of the fact they feel unsupported, socially excluded. They don't get support from their peers because learning is a social construct. If you then look at applying for jobs, you are far less likely to be shortlisted for a consultant's post if you're from an ethnic minority, far less likely to be offered that post. In 2021, just 2 years ago, the BMJ showed that you were 6 times as likely to get a job as a doctor in London, 6 times less likely if you were black, and 4 times less likely if you were Asian. That's today's NHS. And then you, of course, have an ethnicity pay gap. If you then look at the micro experiences, so we've just been talking about these statistics. If you are a black doctor, you have a 50% chance of feeling over-scrutinized at work, 4 in 10 Asians, compared to 4% of white British. Being assumed to be in a more junior role, 58% of black doctors experience that, nearly half of Asian doctors, only 7% of white British report that experience. Having derogatory comments at work, 54% of blacks, doctors, 54% black doctors, 44% of Asian, but just 7% of white. Being socially excluded is one of the most painful experiences for any of us when you're in the workplace. But just look at this. 52% of black doctors report feeling socially excluded, 44% of Asian, but just 5% of white British. Now, if you add all of this up, it takes a cumulative toll on a person's well-being. 60% of doctors say their physical and mental health has suffered. And behind the statistics, these individual stories, and I've talked to countless doctors, their lives are being wrecked. Doctors who've come from other countries are going back, just ringing up their families at home, saying it's all right, whilst they're suffering in silence. And then, of course, if you look at so this is the human cost. But then let's just look at the cost to the NHS. Patient care and patient safety, patient quality. We have a situation where the population is being denied the full potential talent of its workforce. You have highly skilled doctors who can do so much, who are so skilled, but being dumbed down, prevented from actually being their best. And the public, the population, patients are being denied. You know that incivility increases cognitive function by 61%, and the risk of medical error is increased by 45 to 63% if you're stressed and burnt out. It's no surprise. We all know what we're like when we feel totally shaken. And therefore, the risk of error, the patient safety, is being compromised by race discrimination and racist experiences. Then let's look at the workforce. We have an NHS in crisis. We are 120,000 vacancies unfilled. And yet you don't hear anyone talking about the fact that 9% of doctors have left the NHS because of racist experiences. 23% are thinking of leaving, and 16% have taken time off work through sickness or because of their negative experiences through racism. So we are actually in a situation where we are shrinking our workforce capacity due to racism. And then the economic context. Okay. So if you actually look at the economic consequences, you know, Roger Klein has estimated £2.3 billion being lost to the NHS through bullying and harassment, and a large part of that will be also racism. We all know, and Yvonne's been a tremendous advocate, she may say a little bit about this, the evidence that NHS organisations and other businesses that actually have an inclusive, equal environment in the workplace environment actually are more productive. They have fewer errors, better patient outcomes. So there's a huge economic cost of not addressing this glaring anomaly. And I think that I'll talk about solutions later when we have the discussion, but just want to say that, you know, correcting race discrimination and racism is, of course, addressing an inherent moral wrong and something that's so much the antithesis of what the NHS stands for. But it's also a no-brainer that it needs to be eradicated for all the reasons that if you want a sustainable NHS, if you want to maximize its workforce potential, if you want patients to be looked after at their best, if you want a content workforce, you have to tackle it. And I don't think we hear enough about that from our policymakers.
Thank you.
And it's very interesting, Sean, that economic cost is the cost of the country's prosperity as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because people are not well enough to work.
Yes.
Okay. So, Shabia. Yeah.
Thank you.
What we know is that without a doubt, the NHS workforce is its best asset. You know, you can talk about all sorts of things like, you know, estates and so on and so forth. But our asset are our staff. Every single one of them, you know, are important. Our nurses, our doctors, our cleaners, our cooks, every single one of them is invaluable. And as my colleagues have already said, there are thousands of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds working in the NHS, and indeed have been working in the NHS since its inception. And I was just outside at the Windrush stand. And we all know that 75 years ago, the SS Windrush landed, or docked, as it were, at Tilbury. And people from Black and Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds have been working in our NHS since then. And without a doubt, the NHS could not function at all without those individuals working in it. And even today, we still go abroad and we bring many, many, many people from across the seas to work in our NHS, sometimes denuding the countries that need those individuals more than we do, so that our NHS could function. But when people get to the NHS, their experience might be something else. The NHS employs 1.4 million people, round about that figure, and that figure has been bandied about for some time. And what we know that nearly 25% of our workforce are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. And in some hospitals in London, there are 70 to 80% of the workforce from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. Now, I have been working in the field of race equality. I am not an EDI expert by any means. I work in race equality and how race impacts health, and how race actually means that we are going to lose money in our NHS if we don't do something practical about it. Now, this slide, and I want you to all have a look at this slide, because many of you will know that I was the director of the Workforce Race Equality Standard for many years, and indeed we started back in 2015 when Simon Stevens agreed that actually we needed to know what the experiences were between Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff and white staff. That was 2015. Now, it doesn't take a genius to look at these figures to see how very slowly change is being made in our NHS. And we know that race inequality has been around for 400 years, but the point with the NHS is that we know that there is an issue. That isn't just Chand or Marie or Andrea. It's all of the senior leaders in the NHS. And how do I know that they know that? Back in 2009, when I was at the Department of Health working with the then Chief Executive of the NHS, Nigel Crisp, who actually put out a report, and it was a strategy called the Leadership Race Equality Action Plan. 5 of the initiatives were for staff, and 5 of the initiatives were for patients in the NHS. And what was said at the time was that leadership was absolutely fundamental and key to actually making sure that Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff in the NHS, and at that time there were only 12 directors of nursing from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and 5 chief executives. Now, there aren't that many more, I have to tell you, because you can see from this slide the pace of change. On this slide, we have what we call the indicators for the RES standard, the Workforce Race Equality Standard. And you can see that the process indicators are moving very slowly. That's indicators 2, 3, and 4. But indicators 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are the really important ones, those are the cultural indicators, are moving in the wrong direction. Black, Asian, and minority ethnic staff are complaining bitterly about their experience in the NHS, the bullying, the harassment, the lack of progression that they have as a consequence of the colour of their skin. And that is not fair, that is not right, it is not equitable. And what it also does is it costs money. It costs lives, because if you're not cared for, it's very, very difficult for you to care. And what we can see in our NHS, and this is across the board over the last 6 months, is the dissatisfaction of staff, of doctors, of nurses, of ambulance staff. And I suspect if we actually took a deep dive into people who are out on the picket lines, who are complaining, quite a substantial number of them would be talking about how difficult it is for them as Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff in our NHS at this time. So we really have to do something about this, because in 2009, Professor Michael West and Jeremy Dawson did a piece of work talking about a spiral of positivity in the best performing trusts. And that could be best evidenced by the experience of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff in the organisation and how they actually felt. Now, at that time, I thought, well, goodness me, this means that all the chief execs are going to read this document and things are going to get better. That was 2009. The same thing was done in 2015, and the same thing was found again. That Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff are a good barometer for what's good in an organisation. And indeed, doing some of the work around the RES, it was very clear which organisations were doing things well as a consequence of the leadership that they actually had in the organisation, showing that Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff were doing well, they were progressing, and as a consequence of that, it saves money and it saves lives. It saves money because people aren't leaving, aren't wanting to, presenteeism, sitting there and just wanting to go home. That extra 10% of discretionary effort that we need from every single member of our workforce, because at the end of the day, the NHS isn't a 9-to-5 service. So we need our staff to want to be there, to give of their best. And how can you, when you feel that you're discriminated against? How can you when you feel actually that people don't want you to be there? How can you when you can see people coming up through the ranks, even though you've been working there for a long, long, long time, and getting to positions that you would want to be in, and not able to get there because of the color of your skin. Now, I know that because yesterday I was listening to Amanda Pritchard talking about her 4 Rs. And she was talking about these 4 Rs last year: reform, respect, I can't remember the rest of them, somebody help me, recovery, and one other. And she said this thing last year. And I remember sitting in the audience and thinking, where's race? Where's race? You must say race. Race has got to be there. Because unless the leaders in our organization pay attention to race, we're not going to get anywhere very fast. And people will say, well, no, Yvonne, actually, you know what? It has to be about equality across the board for all protected characteristics. Well, have a look at this. This is a slide from the Workforce Race Equality Standard, showing that the thing that people complain about the most in terms of all the protected characteristics is race. We are looking at equity, we're not looking at equality. Because if we do the same thing for everybody, we're not going to get the outcome we're looking for. We have to focus on race. And my friend Victor Abadawali, who is not in the audience, I don't think, will always say, well, actually, there are black people from LGBT backgrounds. There are black people and Indian people who are disabled. There are black women. So focusing on race actually helps to move the agenda in terms of making sure that things stack up for everybody in the NHS in the right direction. And I'm really, really happy to have been on a panel with the people from Wales who've pulled together an anti-racist strategy. I commend it to you. You should read it. It is really very, very, very good. And I am an advocate for focusing on race to take all of the protected characteristics in the right direction, because the evidence shows that that is what works and that is what we should do. So from my perspective, and I think from everybody else up here, it's an absolute no-brainer to focus on race, to make sure that we have high-quality patient care, patient safety, and patient satisfaction through a workforce that feels valued, appreciated, and ultimately motivated to continue working for the NHS. Thank you.
I think you agree, for very evidence-based, passionate presentations from each of our speakers that clearly show both the structural nature, the impact on people, and the cost of racism, both to our workforce and the people that we care for. Now it's over to you. So there's Slido, and I'm trying to put the machine on. There's Slido, which I believe everybody's aware of. It can be, you go to slido.com, and it's the hashtag NHS ConfedExpo. And you'll be able to ask questions on Slido for those of you not brave enough to put up your hand to ask the question. But there should also be roving mics. Yep, brilliant. And already I've got somebody waving at me for a question to be asked. So yes, over to you.
Hi, that's lovely. I'm Indrani. I work in trials based in Oxford. I have to give a bit of a context for my questions. The day before, I got a call from my daughter's school saying that she was part of, she experienced a racist incident.
I can't hear.
And sadly, this was not the first time, because the very first time it happened, I went and joined the curriculum board in the school as a brown Indian mother. My question is, what advice would you give to someone like me in order to address this in my own capacity? So tools, examples, in my own capacity to tackle this without anger, and without feeling isolated or victimized, because that leads to a whole plethora of things, self-sabotage, etc. How can I approach this with empathy? How can I support the other person who has just been part of that incident and, involved in that racist comment or incident?
I didn't hear the question.
Thank you. So how do you tackle it?
So, I mean, how we've dealt with it as a family, and many months after my dad passed away, we had some members of the community come up to us and pay their respects, but also give us a really good telling off as to why did we allow him to go into the NHS in the first place. You know, we was bound to end up dead with some of the comments, or we were told that, you know, he would have still been alive if he was here. And it would be really easy for us to be really angry and get consumed in anger, because it's my father, it's your daughter, for example. It is angry when they're faced with discrimination or racist attacks, because, you know, a lot of the times these first instances are in school playgrounds. No one's born a racist. It happens in school playgrounds. And I guess what we've done to be able to detach ourselves from the anger and let go of that is really believe in a system where, you know, I think one of you said that rules and regulations are not going to solve the problems that we have. You know, that's the intent. What we actually need is action. So the fact that you've been proactive and you're already a member of the school board shows that you care and that you want to make a difference. But, you know, because you're there, if these things are happening and they're repeating, you know, you're at the epicenter to be able to actually make a difference, make that change, and give support to your daughter to know that actually through communication and through work that you're going to be able to support her get through this, and not only get through it, be able to thrive within it, which hopefully what we want to do with our dad's legacy in the end.
Thank you. Sean.
Yeah, so 70% of doctors who experience racism do not report it. They don't report it because they feel their employer, their managers will not support them. Even worse, they feel that if they do report it, they'll be seen as being a troublemaker and actually it would affect their career progression. That is exactly what they tell us. So the true extent of racism is actually suppressed. It doesn't even get known about because people suffer in silence. So what needs to happen, sadly, in the situation we're in at the moment, my advice to any other healthcare professional is you need to protect yourself with advocacy. Make sure that you use a trade union and someone to actually support you right at the beginning, because actually if you're left alone, the evidence is you do come to harm, sadly. And that's a sad reflection. But we also need to do better, and the system has to change. And the system has to change, in my view, in terms of leadership. You know, how many leaders actually are appointed on their abilities and belief, not just some political correct activity, their belief in inclusivity, their belief in celebrating diversity, their belief in creating a speak-up culture. And it's not just about racism. We all know, all of us working in the NHS know, we don't actually operate in a true speak-up culture. We operate in a culture of fear whenever you raise a concern. Not whenever, but to a large degree. So I do think that there needs to be a twin-track strategy. Protect yourself through the right support systems, but you have to address the systemic culture that actually breeds this sort of racist behavior.
Do you want to go in?
I'm just agreeing with
okay.
Absolutely.
And I think the other thing I would say, it's okay to feel angry. Of course we feel angry. Of course we feel hurt. But it's how you use that emotion to create change and how you work with others in supporting yourself to do so. And I was pleased to hear that you wanted to help the other person to change, and that's what's really important. So you've got your hand up, the woman in black. I can't see who wants to ask the question. And then we have someone at the front. Some people at the front, yeah. I'll take 3 questions, perhaps.
Hi, I'm Max Usman. I'm a nurse. I've worked for 51 years in the NHS. I came from Mauritius when I was 19, and I've spoken at the 75th anniversary of the NHS about my experience. All the panel said the right thing. I've been through all of that. But for that lady who talked about the school, when I first came to Lancashire in 1988, my children were being abused in the playground. And I went to the head teacher and said, what can we do about this? So I went to the school and gave a presentation where I was come from, about Mauritius, about the dodo, about the island of Mauritius. And my daughter, who was about 6 at the time, was in the audience. So she dived under the desk because Dad was speaking. And this little girl said to me, excuse me, there was an Indian girl, do you have television there? So I explained to her what we are. We're just part of the same world, and we are different. And then when I was at home where I lived, because I dared to go and live in a white neighborhood. I bought a nice house, and the kids around where I was living was throwing stone at my house, was throwing snowball at my house. We were petrified. So I had the courage to actually go and chase these boys, find out where they live. I had the audacity to knock on the door. I was petrified, didn't know what reaction I was going to get. And I said, the parents was there, they were very good. They said, oh, these those kids. They were diving under the sofa, and they brought them all out. And I said, yes. From then on, that stopped. But they moved on, and then I don't have any issues there where I live. And then when I look around me now, there's a lot of people who look like me who's actually dare to come and live in that neighborhood. So we are diverse in that community. At work, it was the same. I went through the ranks. It was very, very painful. Everyone knows my story, and Navid knows my story. But what I want to say to the panel, why don't we get the NHS to publish that workforce strategy? It's been written. It's sitting down with the government. Why can't we get them to do that and make sure the well-being of our staff is at the forefront of it? Because I've had all these experiences you talk about, and I'm the lead.
Thank you. I'm going to have to, because I've got about 3 people that I can see in the front, and there's probably more at the back, but it's really great, and I really enjoyed your speech earlier as well. So there's a gentleman in the front. So that was the workforce strategy, gentleman in the front, and there's a woman just here with her hand up. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Peter Carter, and can I thank all of the panelists, including yourself, Marie, on really powerful presentations. Mine is a practical question. All of the slides were really interesting. Will they be available on the Confed website? Because I'd like to take it away and absorb some of that.
I'll make sure it is. I don't know who I have to tell, but I'm going to make sure. Yeah. Okay.
Hi,
yeah.
My name's Julie Powell. I run a charity called Community Barnet. Really, really interesting presentations. Thank you all very much indeed. But I want to just put a bit of a reality check around this, because the Department of Health have released lots of tackling inequalities money. Particularly, it's always been available, and I live and work in London, and I sat on one of the big North London Foundation trusts. They had an EDI group. They managed to get some money to actually try and tackle some of the health inequalities. And then alongside that, there was some money put for white leaders effectively to go out and be able to understand the challenges of what people were. I think it was called the White Allies Programme. That's also being delivered through the NHS. But the point is that for people who want to raise questions, to be disruptive, as particularly people of colour, people from racialised communities, we get penalised and we get sanctioned. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the bit that we've just got to understand in terms of the tensions. Mm-hmm. So the Department of Health are giving money on one hand, and yet when we're going to have to ask you to changes, be. Yeah. So I just wanted to just put that as a statement out there, and that's happening. So it's about how can we address that tension for all.
Yeah, it's rather similar to the woman at the back there who said, how do I get support to raise concerns? There's a woman here and there's a gentleman in the front who's been waving his hands at me. I can't quite see him, but I can see his hand waving.
Yeah. Thank you. My name's Asha Day. I'm from Leicestershire in Rutland. I have 2 jobs, and in my day job I do one thing, and my other job I do something else. I just want to say, because I've worked in race equality, as everyone will know, Chan will know, people come to me, and when a white male senior executive comes to you and says, this is happening, and I want him to be an active bystander, and he says, if I raise this, I am career limiting. That's a white male executive. Imagine if that was a brown or a black person. They're doing the same. So I agree with Chan. And the last thing I want to say is thank you for sharing your story. My husband came out of hospital 2 weeks ago, and I can absolutely say that's the same experience. Wow. And when the GP or the doctor talked about DNR, because my husband is white English, he didn't talk to me, he talked to my sister-in-law.
Right, wow.
Yeah.
And all of that is similar. And when I asked to see the chief nurse, it was ignored for 3 weeks. It wasn't until my chief executive said, okay, we'll see what we can do. 24 hours later, I get an email, I'd like to see you. And what I did was take the pain out of it, write an 8-page briefing. These are the points. Take the anger,
I'm
whatever.
really sorry.
It's a nursing thing, so it's about patient care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Marie. That was me waving my hand.
Oh, hi.
I wanted to say thank you very much to Shaiba. I mean, not a dry eye in the hall, I'm sure, listening to your story and your family story, and condolences, really.
Thank you.
My prime. So I'll try and be brief, Marie, because
You have to be brief because I got them on.
I'll
I've
be
got 6
very
minutes
brief.
for them to answer.
I'll be very brief, which is about the 5th hour. I think Yvonne has touched a very good note here. There are the great and the good, including yourself. I've got a gentleman here on my left. There are lots of good people here. Why can we not get Amanda Pritchard this year to put a different R in a manifesto, which is race? There is no reason for her not to do that, because it's a win-win, as everyone was saying.
Yep.
I also think that I'll give a plug, because at least 3 of us, Chan, Paul, Yvonne Cogill and I, are on the Future of the NHS commissioned report by the BMJ. And we met last week and we talked mostly about this. Workforce is going to be the most important factor in the government and the Department of Health meeting its aims. The last thing I would say is, over the years that oh, by the way, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm also a co-lead of the RHO's mental health group. The last thing I would say is I've never seen anybody senior being accountable for res statistics going the wrong way. Why is that? Can we not put accountability into all of this, please?
Thank you. I've got loads of people with their hands up, and I've only got about 4 minutes for people to answer questions. I'm really sorry. We'll try and hang around for a little bit afterwards. Obviously, we'll ask for a longer session next year. So, question on accountability. Accountability, Yvonne. It's because I'm shocked because Danny was called good. A question on accountability, Yvonne.
Yeah.
A question about, I suppose, for Chand, about actually how do we raise questions? I think that's been one, and not have that career limited. A question for Andrea: how do we support white leaders? And I think for Shabir, actually about how did you find support from outside of your family, from your communities? Right.
Yeah.
It means we've got a minute each.
Yeah,
Go.
very quickly. Accountability is a really interesting one, because I remember sitting around a table with lots of senior white leaders and them actually saying, oh, well, we really can't push it too much because, this agenda item is really tricky and it's very difficult, and how are we going to hold people to account and so on. The NHS has tried to hold people to account through the CQC inspection process, which let's tell the truth, has failed. It doesn't work. If organisations are particularly poor on these statistics, they could still get good, they can still get outstanding, and I can tell you several organisations that have had good and outstanding with really poor res results. So the issue is, how important do our senior leaders see this agenda? The new EDI strategy that's come out, that colleagues in the audience have written, and so on, actually talks about accountability. What it doesn't say, or isn't clear, is who's going to hold who to account, and what will the sanctions be as a consequence of people not getting this right. Because that is the bit of the jigsaw that they have in the Welsh strategy that talks about people who are experiencing the discrimination actually holding the government to account, the council to account, and actually making the decisions about what happens to them as a consequence of not getting this right. I don't think we're in that ballpark yet. I don't think psychologically
I'm going to have to move on. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I was just getting into my swing, but I don't think we have the right accountability at the moment. I just don't. So.
Chan.
So I think that accountability starts at the top, and if you have ministers talking about migration being a problem for the UK and use that sort of language, you're going to have racism, and it's as simple as that. And so they need to be accountable for the language they use, and they don't use language that actually celebrates and values the contribution of ethnic minorities, without whom the NHS would collapse tomorrow. And so I do think that's important. Second, you have to accept that racism is a reality in the NHS. Try and find that word in a word search in an NHS England document. I don't think it even exists, I'm not sure. It's all sorts of words like equality, but you don't actually address it. So how will you then make changes on the ground in the workplace if you're not even honest about it? And I'm not even saying that being honest about a problem needs to be about shame. In fact, you can convert it into something so positive by saying we recognize there's an issue, but you know what? We're going to be an organization, the largest employer of public servants, and really make it a success, because we really value the full potential of each of you, especially those of you who've come from other countries, those of you who've worked so hard. We don't get that language. And then finally, as I said earlier, it is about leadership. You do need to hold leaders to account to really be genuine in their passion to embrace inclusivity.
Phew. Andrea?
Okay, you asked me how to support white leaders. As white leaders, we've got to be brave and we've got to speak up. I mean, to be perfectly honest, listen to Shabir, how brave was that? Mm-hmm. We should take inspiration. We should, however, try and make sure that we've got our own support. And so I'm blessed to have the friendship of Marie and Yvonne, and I know that I've got them to talk to if I need to when there's a problem that I'm facing. So make those connections as well. And there are so many groups that we can do that with now, one of which Asha helps to lead. But I do understand about the fear of retaliation, because we do see that, retaliatory referrals into fitness to practice if somebody's raised concern. But we have changed our process, and we ask about context, and we ask if that is the background to the issue that's been raised with us. So increasingly, people are alive to this and thinking more broadly about it, which ought to give people confidence to do the right thing, because we have to do the right thing, because otherwise, if we don't, all of the things that Chand and Yvonne have spoken about, and that Shabir and Asha then, from a recent experience described, will continue to happen.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, and quite quickly, I guess, initially the NHS kind of bogged us down with a lot of bureaucracy, and we weren't quite sure which way to turn, but then we were blessed to work with people like Leslie, who leads the Hope Network, and as the patient care experience lead, that's really propelled our story, and we'll work closely with Leslie and Sarah and Daljit, who actually is the reason why I'm here today. So yeah, lots of great people in the NHS that have really helped to propel us as a family voice to get this story out there, so thank you.
Brilliant. You did really well in getting us to our closure. Just want to say, it's really important you have the evidence, but also the tools to make that change. The report will be out, I'm looking at Sam, in terms of the cost to the NHS of racism in the autumn. Yeah, he said yes. So it's really important. You can go to our stand on N2 in the exhibition. We've got an exhibition stand there, and you can actually, all our reports are free because the knowledge is so important and the what to do is so important. But I'm going to end by bigging up my incredible panel, and we will hang around for those that weren't able to ask their questions. Thank you so much, and thank you, audience.